All right, so photosynthesis, as we talked about before, is my favorite formula coming up with this. This is a verbal definition of photosynthesis. And before you start writing, I just want to kind of review a couple terms with you because they might seem scary otherwise. What does the word anabolic mean? We've heard this before, as opposed to catabolic.
Is it building up?
Yes, building a molecule. So this sentence, an anabolic endergonic carbon dioxide requiring process that uses light energy and water to produce organic macromolecules. It sounds really big and intensive and scary, but when we look at it, anabolic just means we're building a molecule. It says right over here what molecule we're building. Sugar. Endergonic, what does that mean? It requires energy for this to be driven, for this reaction to happen. We know it's requiring carbon dioxide. We know what our energy source is. We've got light energy. Easy peasy once you start breaking it down. Now, thinking about quizzy type questions, would I ever ask you on an exam to write out this word for word? What might I ask you on a quiz or an exam? I might ask you about which of these words describes photosynthesis. I might give you, in comparison to endergonic, I might give you the word exergonic. What does that mean? It produces energy as its endpoint instead of requiring energy. So you can think about how I might use these terms in a quiz, but I'm not going to ask you to write out word for word. This is a definition for photosynthesis. Here's my favorite formula again. I'm just going to make sure that you keep seeing that formula over and over again. You've seen it before. My recommendation would be to put it on a sticky note and put it wherever you look every single day. On your computer, on your mirror in your bathroom, on the milk jug in the kitchen, on your parents' forehead because you look at them all the time. Put it and make it the screen cover for your phone. So every time you unlock your phone, you see it. Stick it around somewhere where you're going to see it a lot. Put it on a T-shirt on your best friend. Everybody looks good in photosynthesis. Does it seem like I might ask you at some point to write out this formula as a quiz or test question? It does seem like the kind of thing I would do. So become familiar with it. It's very elegant, and beautiful, and meaningful, and expressionful. Let's talk about thylakoids. This is that structure inside the chloroplast where part of the reaction of photosynthesis is going to occur. So we have the stacks, the granum stacks. I think of these like granny's pancake stacks. You got a whole bunch of thylakoids all stacked up together. You've got the membrane of the thylakoid and the interior space of the thylakoid. There are reaction components happening in each of these. The thylakoid membrane, anytime you've got membrane in your head, it should tell you that there's a potential then for concentration gradient on the inside and the outside. And that's part of what drives the reaction of photosynthesis, is that you can have a higher or lower concentration inside the thylakoid or outside the thylakoid thanks to the membrane. All right, so the chlorophyll molecule itself is located inside the thylakoid membranes. Chlorophyll has got magnesium in the center, which creates a charge gradient. Remember that if you have molecules that have positive, or ions that have a positive charge or a negative charge, that can drive reactions as well. So by creating a charge gradient, that means that we're going to have electrons moving around, trying to balance out that positively charged area. Or it's going to attract other ions because they are negatively charged. So chlorophyll, the color that we see from chlorophyll is green. And that's because chlorophyll doesn't absorb green. It reflects green. Just like your shirts are blue or white because they are, well, in the case of blue, they are absorbing other colors and reflecting blue. In the case of white, they are absorbing all colors and not reflecting any colors. In the case of black, they are reflecting all the colors and not absorbing any. So I'm not going to ask you to memorize the wavelength of the color, but it's important to recognize that that color is, we see the green because it's not being absorbed. It's not an optimum light wavelength for that chlorophyll to the plant to be operating on. So if we tried to grow plants under just green light, what do you think would happen? Chlorophyll is critical, right? Getting that right wavelength is critical to driving photosynthesis. If we don't give it to it, we only give it green wavelength, and we know that's not effective, we're not going to see a lot of photosynthesis happening. A little bit, not a lot. Different plants have slightly different shades of green, which show us that they're going to be utilizing different wavelengths, which could be really helpful in different parts of the world or even different parts of the forest canopy. Plants that are down on the floor of the canopy have had light filtering through lots of other plants to get down there. So they rely on a slightly different wavelength section than the plants at the top of the forest canopy. When we look at this, we can see that our plants are relying on much more intense or high energy wavelengths to be able to do their photosynthesis activity. So we're looking at the lower end of the wavelength, around the 450 to 550 to 600. This is ideal for most plants on the planet. I don't know if anybody has ever seen grow lights, which are something that you can use for plants that are inside, because these fluorescent lights that we have over us, or incandescent lights, are actually not going to be involving or releasing the most effective plant growth lights. So you can get plant grow lights that are down in this lower end of the spectrum to provide most effective energy for your plants. When you start thinking about potential IA things, this is one of the areas that you could be investigating, is different wavelengths or impact of different wavelengths. What kind of a quiz question do you think I might write you out of this information here? Okay. Or I might ask you to explain why that is an optimum wavelength. What would you say? Anybody can help out with this one. Why is it that this is a better wavelength down here than this area up here in the 600, 700s? More efficient, right? We're getting more energy in there. Good. Nice job. All right, so moving on to this is a reflective relative amount, right? We don't have any actual numbers on our y-axis, but it's just showing the absorption rates of different colors. Now, your plant leaf actually has lots of different colors in it. We talked about this before. We see green for the most part when it's growing. But think about it. In the very beginning part of the leaf's life, it's a different color of green than it is later, right? It's a very bright green so that it can absorb a lot of intense light, and then as it grows bigger and bigger, it gets different colors in there and it starts to appear different. So green is our lowest absorption rate. We're going to see sometimes in other plants you're not going to see the violet and blue because it gets absorbed by the plant. Has anybody ever seen any leaves that are blue or purple, hostas, or there's a variety of decorative plants that people will put in their garden that have these bright red or bright purple colors to them because they stand out against all the greenery. So those plants obviously are not relying on absorbing that wavelength as much. They're going to focus their efforts more on the green areas. But overall, worldwide, we tend to see less absorption in the greens, more absorption from the violets and the blues, and the oranges and the reds, slightly smaller peak. So what does this tell us about the absorption of flowers with colors, with light colors? Is there a lot of photosynthetic activity happening in flowers? There's very little that's actually happening. Those colors are not optimum for those flowers are not optimum for photosynthesis because they have very few chloroplasts actually in their cells. So it's not just what color you appear to be, it's also how much do you have in the way of chloroplasts for the photosynthesis to occur. So what are the flowers going to do for the plant instead of photosynthesis? reproduction. They protect the egg, the ovum. They provide a place for fertilization. Maybe they even attract some pollinators or some organisms to come in and eat the seeds. So their function is a little bit different. And I'm pointing it out just because we're talking a lot about color right now, and I don't want us to get off track at the idea of what the flowers do. It does have color, but its photosynthetic activity is very low. All right. Questions? We good? All right, moving on. So this phrase you have seen before. What does it mean? The redox reaction. Cellular respiration. Yeah, you were? Excellent. So this is just a shorthand for the reduction oxidation chain that we know is going to happen. So the first part of that, well, the second part of that actually, oxidation reaction. So this is where you either have a loss of oxygen, electrons or a gain of oxygen. So when we look at our gorgeous, lovely, elegant formula, we can see that our oxidation material is coming from the water and forming oxygen gas, the O2 that we want to breathe. Oxidation. And we know with a redox reaction, if we have oxidation, we have to have reduction. Which of these molecules are going to be reduced? Which molecules are not involved yet in the redox reaction? Carbon dioxide and glucose. So we are going to have the movement of electrons. So we're going to have the movement of electrons from water to oxygen. And in our reduction reaction, we're going to have movement from carbon dioxide to glucose. I know you've heard these terms before. It's the same process. Anywhere in chemistry, if you have a redox reaction, it means the same thing. Here we're just identifying where the electrons are moving to and from.
So the CO2 gets reduced to glucose.
Yes. Sharks in the pool. All right, so the first aspect or the first type of reactions that we're going to talk about with photosynthesis has got several names. Light reaction, or my preferred one, and the way I will ask you on a quiz or an exam, is the light-dependent reaction. The reason I like light-dependent reaction is it gives us an accurate description of what has to happen. This reaction will not occur if the wavelengths that are required are not present. So if it's dark, or if the wavelengths, if we have different kinds of grow lights on it, this reaction will not happen. And this part of the reaction is what generates the energy or packages the energy for the second part of the reaction that actually produces the glucose. So in this one, in the presence of light, the light photons are going to excite the electrons so that they move, so that redox reaction happens. And that takes ADP, which the plant has, and gets it into ATP, so it adds a phosphate onto that, and it also adds a phosphate onto NADH, which you know from cellular respiration, and changes it into NADPH. This is happening also inside the thylakoid membranes. And again, this sets up the reaction for the actual glucose production. If this doesn't happen, the glucose will not be produced. And as I mentioned before, thanks to membranes and having membranes, we're able for the process of chemiosmosis to occur. You saw this as well in cellular respiration, and it's just the movement of chemicals across that membrane. And this is happening across the thylakoid membrane. And we call this process that results photophosphorylation. Photo just means light, so it's this phosphorylation you're familiar with, the addition of a phosphate onto a molecule. We did that in cellular respiration. You keep hearing me say, that's similar to cellular respiration, because these are just the reverse processes. You're building a molecule or you're breaking it down. But in this case, with photophosphorylation, it means it happens because of the light photons. That's the energy that allows that ATP to be made. Yes. Diagram, I do not want you to draw, but I want to explain it to you, and I think once we do, you'll understand. We've seen all of these parts before. So what do these cute little lines with the circles look like? Phospholipid layer, right? We know this. We know how this operates quite well. You guys did a beautiful job with this when we were studying cells earlier. All right, so over here we have proton pumps. What does that tell us automatically has to be happening? Active transport, which requires energy. So the cell has to spend a little bit of energy to make photosynthesis work, to make it happen. So it spends that energy by pumping hydrogens across the membrane. Why does it have to pump the hydrogens across the membrane? Why can't they just move through the phosphate? We have a low concentration outside and a high concentration inside. And you're right, they are also charged, so we have to be cautious about that. But if it was just high to low concentration, this hydrogen can move through in a channel protein, right? We have to have an actual pump because our concentration out here is low, our concentration inside is high. But boy, that cell cannot do the photosynthesis without those hydrogen molecules, and so it's willing to spend a little bit of energy to import that inside the thylakoids so that it can make the glucose, which is the big payoff. Yes?
So if it's high concentration inside and low concentration outside, what's stopping the hydrogens from coming out?
They get pumped in faster than they come out. They will go out. Yeah. All right. So, again, you don't need to draw this, but just recognize this is nothing scary. This is nothing new. Very similar membranes. Membranes act the same in every organism everywhere. Okay? All right. So part 2 of our phases of photosynthesis. This one I really dislike the name, and it has multiple names as well. 2 that you'll commonly hear are the Calvin cycle, named after some dude named Calvin, who was the first to describe it accurately. It's also sometimes called the dark cycle, which I particularly dislike as a name, because it makes the suggestion that it can only happen or only happens in the dark. And in fact, it simply is light independent, which means it can happen in the daytime, and it can happen in the dark. Light is not important. Light only is important for the production of the energy that this part of the cycle will now use to produce glucose. So if you don't have any light, you don't have any energy produced, and you won't have any sugar made in this stage of photosynthesis. But this stage will happen in the light, and it will happen in the dark. It's using the energy that was produced in the first part of photosynthesis to actually make the sugar. This is more complicated than what I'm showing you guys today. You'll see that in the lecture notes that you're going to take online tonight, and or this weekend. And you'll have a choice of 2 styles. RXN means reaction. It's an abbreviation that we frequently use. And then the other abbreviation that you'll see a lot as we're working with this unit is PSN, which, what does that potentially stand for? Photosynthesis. Because that's a long word, PSN. Now, if you were writing on a short answer on a quiz or an exam and you wrote PSN, I'm going to probably circle it and highlight it and make it obvious to you that you use the abbreviation there. You want to use the full word just to be in that practice. But for your notes, for worksheets and stuff like that, it makes sense just to abbreviate. It's a big word. Yes?
So they don't need light to do the reaction.
This phase, the light-independent reaction, does not require light for it to run. But if it doesn't have any energy created in the earlier phases, it won't run. So it's dependent on light in that light makes the energy that makes this run, but it can happen in the dark, it can happen in the light. That doesn't mean that this reaction is going to happen all night long or all day long. It can be happening right now in the daytime, and then we remove light from the plant, and that reaction will continue until it has used all of the available ATP and NADPH as an energy source, and then it stops. And then the sun comes up, and the plant makes more ATP and NADPH, and this part of the reaction will start again. So it starts and stops and starts This reaction is occurring in this stroma, not in the thylakoid. So the energy is produced in the thylakoid, exported out to the stroma, where this reaction can occur. The reaction overall requires carbon dioxide. That goes into your glucoses. And it uses or requires 18 ATP and 12 NADPH. Once the phosphates have been removed, so now we have ADP, the energy has been utilized to make the sugar, and the NADPH becomes NADH again. Those just cycle around inside of the cell, and the ADP gets grabbed up by thylakoids again to be turned into ATP. So that's an endless cycle of transfer from ADP to ATP, and NADPH to NADH, back to NADPH, back to NADH, around and around and around. So these two molecules, the ATP and the NADPH, are endlessly reused. All right, questions? So this is the background framework that you need to know to make sense of the lecture notes that you're going to have. I know with both the lecture notes you have an option of either the Khan Academy, which is actually broken out into 2 videos. So you've got one that's just about the light reaction and one that's just about the light independent reaction, or a crash course video. And I know particularly the crash course video guide, he talks very fast. So you'll hear some of this stuff in there, but this gives you the framework to be able to understand those very information-packed